Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to the Open Mic Writers in Their Own Words, the show where every episode I talk to writers, editors, and occasionally agents in the publishing game to learn about them and the work they do, and hopefully how their experiences may help you in your own efforts to become a published author, which is what all of us are always striving to do in this game. Before I introduce my guest today, please take a moment and hit the subscribe button so you never miss a future episode. And if you like what you hear or see today, and I parse it that way because you might be watching the show on YouTube or you might be listening on a podcast platform in your car or other somewhere else. If you like it, please tell a friend. It is absolutely the best way for endeavors like this one to keep gaining an audience. And I, reviews are great also. If you wanted to leave us a nice review, that'd be great. I deeply appreciate either or of those. And as I often say, if you like it, tell a friend. And if you don't, please keep that to yourself. No one needs to know that. Uh, my guest today is the author of three best-selling suspense thrillers across two separate series. And the first starring disease ecologist Letty Duquesne, while the second features attorney Tess Oliver, both of whom deal with some very scary scientific issues around fatal viruses, terrorism, and of course, because this is a thriller series, murder, lots of murder. Uh, she's here with me today to talk about those novels, and those are Inhuman Acts, which came out in 2022, The Carolina Variant, which came out in 2023, and Unnatural Intent, which came out in 2024. And I presume the new stuff that she's working on that should be coming out, I'm sure, sometime soon. We're going to get into all that in just a moment. We're going to talk a little bit about her writing career and what she learned from her previous career as a lawyer that helped shape her as an author. So, with all that, please welcome Brooke French to the Open Mic, Writers in Their Own Words. Brooke, how are we doing today?
Awesome. Really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Well, okay, so for folks who maybe have not discovered your books yet, why don't we just start with you telling us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned, I'm a recovering lawyer. I practiced as a litigator in Atlanta for 14 years before I hung up the suit, moved to the West Coast, and started writing full time. Um, I started my first book in 2018, which is actually the second book that got published. And as with all of my books, it was I realized the sort of underappreciated risk of a pandemic, and I'm very sorry to say that I was right. So I wrote the Carolina variant 2018, 2019, and then of course, unfortunately, saw that realized in 2020 with COVID. So that started me off writing sort of science-based thrillers, and I've been doing it ever since.
Well, yeah, I know. COVID really screwed the pooch for a lot of us in this world. I actually did a whole separate series of this show focusing on creativity and beyond authors, some of the musicians and other folks I know, just, talking about how it impacted the creativity that, we depend on in our world. And it both a blessing and a curse in some ways, but more definitely more bad than good. I don't want to act like there was anything good about COVID, but I mean,
Yeah.
for some folks, it gave them a little time to focus on that part, and but I think for a lot of people, they found it really difficult to be creative during that time. I think we all just were so knocked off our game. How, this wasn't in my original set of questions, but since we brought up COVID, how did that affect you? Especially as you're just really kind of getting started into what you hope is going to be a new career, to
Mhm.
suddenly have that, you know, uh, big rock thrown into the puddle.
Well, yeah, of course it was. It put everything on its ear. You know, with that first book that I wrote, I went to pitch it to agents in early 2020, January 2020, and I would get back this feedback. This is great, but we can't sell it because it felt like profiteering at that point. You know, we didn't know what COVID was going to be, and so the book was. It seems on its face like it would have been really timely, but it was actually the opposite. So I wound up putting it aside and writing Inhuman Acts. because I really I thought they were right. I felt really uncomfortable with pitching that book then. And so it changed the trajectory of the books because of that, because I did just put it down and start something new. It also changed the way that I write because I had small children at the time. They weren't going to school. So trying to write with them, in my tiny little house, I live in a really small house. And so with them kind of on top of me as I was writing, it changed my process a good bit.
Yeah, I think that's one I've heard a lot too. I mean, look, my daughter is almost 40 years old now, so I don't have to think about having the small kids, but I have so much sympathy for anyone who had small kids during COVID, regardless of what field they were in. The
Yeah,
world just absolutely flipped on its head, and boy, that was a tough one.
it was. Taught me that I would never have been a teacher in any other life because I was absolutely terrible at trying to, manage their schooling at home.
Yeah, I think a lot of us could relate to that. Well, so you called yourself a recovering lawyer, which I love that. We're going to talk more about that throughout all of this conversation. But let me just start that, a lot of lawyers have become authors, but
Mhm.
usually when they do, they write legal thrillers. How did you come to decide to have your characters be focused on issues like, viruses and these other things that are? I know one of your main characters is a lawyer, but the focus is still around diseases and rabies and things like that. How was the process for you? For coming to have that kind of a focus for your characters?
Yeah, so I think when I stopped practicing law, I really wanted to think about anything other than practicing law. I was kind of burnt out when I started my first book. I also think that most of the practice of law is excruciatingly boring, and I didn't, yeah, didn't think that people would enjoy reading it if it was done accurately. Most legal thrillers, legal drama, it's not accurate. It's not how it actually is. And so I struggled with this idea of having to put something so inaccurate on the page. And I'm not knocking people that do legal thrillers. I think they can be done really well. But I thought that the possibility of cutting a corner that I would see on the page and say, that's not how that would work, would really drive me nuts. So I decided to avoid it. I do have several books where the main character is a lawyer, and that, of course, is because I know how to do it. I know what
Right.
that world is like, and so I have a manuscript that's actually with my beta readers right now. My fourth book. The main character in that one is also a lawyer, but as I did with the Carolina variant, she's a lawyer who was very quickly taken out of her normal life. So we're not watching a lawyer go through the motions of normal, practice as a civil litigator. She's tossed into a completely different situation, which allowed me to both understand how to tell the story in a way that was true, but not necessarily bore you to death in the process, I hope.
I totally can relate to that. As a journalist, it's tough for me to watch any kind of a movie or TV show about or read books about journalists because they almost always do things that no legitimate reporter would ever do.
Yeah.
And some of it's really extreme. Like, I love Paul Newman and Sally Field, but I tried to watch Absence of Malice, and it's like nobody sleeps with their sources. We don't do stuff like that. And just
Yeah.
all of these other things you see where, I mean, yes, our job can be excruciatingly boring too, because especially if you're an investigative person, you spend most of your time pouring through documents and trying to,
Mhm.
us connect the dots on very arcane information. And yeah. It is not what I would call the most thrilling thing. Most if anyone thinks it's that, they're probably wrong.
Yeah.
Now I understand you also wanted to write from an early age, but
Mhm.
like many of us, you focused first on something where you could actually have a career and make a living. But when did you know that it was time for you to walk away and pursue writing as a career?
So I think there were two big moments. And the first one, I was stuck in horrific traffic. We lived in Atlanta at the time, and I was commuting at least an hour each way, and it was miserable. And I had this moment in traffic of realizing that writing was what I really wanted to do, and I think that is huge because so many people never have that moment. They never realize
Um,
this is what I want to do. And they go their whole lives just doing a job and never realizing, never feeling a calling to something in that way. And so I feel really fortunate that I did have the moment of this is what I want to do. I've always been a voracious reader, and that's how I survived the commute as I would listen to audiobooks in the car. So I had that moment where I thought, okay, this is what I really want to do. And then at the time, I had a very young baby and a 2-year-old son. And I was doing this commute and I was traveling a ton for work and I wasn't home. And I was just becoming progressively more miserable with that lifestyle. And so at a certain point, I went to my husband and I said, how do you feel about me taking a sabbatical, taking a year, seeing if I could write a book, seeing if I could make a go of this? And he was like, let's think about it. And I thought, well, that's a better reaction than I thought. I
right.
expected him to just be like, what are you talking about? I mean, I was a shareholder in a big law firm. I had worked very hard for the success of it. I was very committed to my job. So it was a little left field for me to just come out with, how do you feel about me completely, basically jettisoning this career that I'd spent my entire adult life building. And then 6 months after that, he had a job opportunity that allowed me to take a step back from the practice of law. When I did it, I really didn't think I'm done with this forever. I think I thought, I hope I'm done with this forever, but I thought the chances were I would need to go back to it. I now live on the West Coast. I never took the California bar. I don't intend to. My hope is to write full time forever.
Hmm.
That I love doing this. It is as fulfilling as I, sitting in traffic that day years and years ago, thought that it would be.
You know, I know making a living, of course, is a huge factor and a big challenge. And anyone that writes books in particular knows, it's almost impossible these days to make a living per se.
Yeah.
But I think most aspiring writers face other really significant questions and challenges, as much as the financial ones. What was maybe the biggest one for you? And I ask because I know that, look, putting yourself out there for
Mhm.
the public consumption and knowing that there's going to be a percentage of people that just tear you to shreds no matter how great you write or whatever the
Yeah.
case may be.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that just terrifies a lot of people into never even trying because they don't want to face that kind of scrutiny. But I mean, there's all kinds of things that might get in the way. What do you feel was maybe your biggest challenge aside from just the financial part of it? Maybe for saying I'm going to do this now.
Yeah. I think knowing how, I mean, it's not innate how you write a story, whatever kind
Very
you want to
true.
write. There's a learning curve. And as a lawyer, and being who I am, which is very A-type, and I like to know what I'm doing. I like to get it right, and so coming at this, which was so different than anything that I had ever done before, I worried about knowing how, doing it right, and I was really fortunate because, when I first started for my first book, I had read all the books about it, right? Because of course you do as a writer, you read everything. But I was fortunate I joined a critique group. And from those other writers, through the process of trial and error, bringing things in and learning from them and getting better and, refinement. And I really, I got it that way, but that was a big obstacle in the beginning, is just you want to do it, but how do you do it? And even taking that leap into it and having the faith in yourself to say, okay, I'm going to let myself be a little bit wrong so that I can get better and ultimately do it the right way. That's hard for a lot of people. It was hard for me.
Yeah, because I think, what's entailed in all that is that, writers and creative people, we want to write the story that's in our head, and that's fine, that's great, except, you know, editors and agents and publishers, what they're looking at is this as a commercial product. I mean, if you
Yeah.
just want to write stories that you write and you get it out of your system and you show it to your spouse or your family, that's great. No, fabulous. But if you're trying to sell books, I mean, people are looking at it as a commercial product, and that I think is a real difficult thing for a lot of creative people to wrap their head around, and it becomes very, very frustrating for them. Did you have any moments in this where maybe the frustration was building or you weren't having success or just it felt like, hey, in this learning process, this curve is just kicking my behind and I bit off more than I could chew here. Did you ever have that feeling or were you like, oh no, oh no, I am getting to the end of this regardless?
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to say that it was the latter, but of course, there's always self-doubt and there are moments where you're just, you have imposter syndrome or whatever it is. I think my first time that I went into the query trenches, my very first book, and I went in and I was trying to sell it and you're getting rejections and it's painful. And so I was in that process and I reached out to a friend who'd published several books and asked her, how do you weather this? How do you come out okay on the other side? And she said, well, you need more than one egg in your basket. You need more than one project because when you have your debut novel, right? Like it feels like you are the novel. You feel like the novel is a proxy for yourself, for your entire success as a writer. And of course, that's not true, But I think I don't want to say it's universal, but I think a lot of writers feel that way. And it was excellent advice because moving on to the next book and writing the next book really saved my mental health as I went through that process. And ultimately, all of the books that I've written have been published, just not in the order that I wrote them.
Right. Well, which is another one of those things I think that people newly getting into this industry, and it is an industry, um, that's one of the shocking things I think for a lot of people is that there's no linear path for everybody. I mean, some people, sure, but for a lot of people, every author I know, I would say 95% of the authors that have come on this show or that I have met in my life will tell you, oh, yeah, I've got this manuscript. Some have two or three or four manuscripts in the drawer that they wrote first and
Mhm.
couldn't sell or for any number of reasons. And then later on, maybe, you know, that first one, as in your case, maybe, later on had success because it's so much about timing. It's so much about what a particular entity might be looking for at that given time. But we
Mhm.
tend to internalize, especially rejection, as, oh, this means I suck at what I do, and why am I doing it? And I don't
Right.
know. I mean, it sounds like, you got some really good advice that helped you not go to that place.
I did. I did, and I'm very grateful. And I've gone back to that friend several times since and said, hey, I want to tell you how pivotal you were, in this journey, how much you helped me persevere and figure it out. And she continues to be a very close writing friend and to help me in a lot of ways. I'm very grateful for writing community. I think you can't oversell the value of surrounding yourself by other writers that will support you as you just continue to push through every day.
Well, it's a little bit of a balancing act too, though, when it comes because I've also talked to writers who felt like, the critique group was critical, but also the right critique group is
Mhm.
really what was more critical. I've definitely known some writers who felt like they got pushed off of what they wanted to do by strong opinions coming from some folks.
Yeah.
And so, in your own with your own beta readers and your own critique group of folks, how did you learn to suss out the kind of advice you were getting and take in the things that you needed to take in and be able to say no to the things that maybe you didn't feel were the things that you needed to take you down a path you didn't want to go. How did you
Yeah.
suss out that criticism and critique and be able to get the most out of it in a way that was actually helpful to you?
Trial and error. So, when I first started, I would take every piece of advice I got. I just thought, well, these people are more experienced than me. They know more than I do, and so I was just, taking it all. And then I realized midway through my first draft of my first book that the book no longer sounded like me because it had all been washed out through all these different people's ideas and edits. And so I began to recognize almost innately the difference between voice, someone is changing the voice of what's being said, and an edit that was more substantive, this is passive voice, or you've got perception words here, or whatever it is that was actually something that you could implement to make the quality of the work better. And sometimes you do get notes that are story related that are actually valid. So it's not to
Hmm.
say that only the copy editing or whatever it is kind of notes are useful. But I think the more you do it, the more you get a natural ear for, does this make the work better? And ultimately that's how I know whether to accept or reject a note that I get from one of my critique partners. Um, and I will say, you know after a while working with other writers, kind of where they are in their writing journey and what you can expect note-wise from them. But even the people that I exchange drafts with who are still, more in the learning stages, they will come up with some pretty amazing stuff sometimes. So I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of validity to exchanging with writers of different skill levels, writers in different genres. I don't think that you have to only exchange with people who write the exact kinds of things that you do. And I also love the idea of giving back because I've had so many people help me as I have learned that I
Mhm.
love the opportunity to do the same thing for other people.
Well, on the subject of learning, you know, what are some of the things that you carried over from your experiences as a lawyer that have helped you in writing? Are there, whether it's principles or just work methods or anything, what is it from your time as a lawyer that has most helped you as a writer?
Um, Probably two things. The biggest is work ethic because I am accustomed to working. So I don't ever have a problem with motivation. I don't have a problem with putting in the time. I work, every minute that I can work on it, I do work on it. So that is helpful. Also, research is, a big commonality between the two. As a lawyer, you cannot be wrong. I mean, you just can't. You have to find the right answer. You have to know 100% whatever it is because your client is relying on you, and there are consequences if you're wrong. So I think I bring that to what I write now too, and I'm frequently writing about things that I've never personally experienced in science or technology or whatever it is, and so. I'm very motivated to find the expert who can then tell me what I'm doing wrong so I can fix it.
I love this. And this is a question I've asked other writers before, but I absolutely love this. I'm friends with a very, very successful author named Jonathan Mayberry who does
Mm.
a lot of scientific based and dark fantasy and things like that. He's had his stuff has been turned into Netflix series and
So
really
cool.
successful. But um, his philosophy is this. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a virologist. I'm not all these things. So he kind of keeps a loose affiliation of folks that are experts in those fields, and he
Mhm.
and he reads all the journals and he reads all the literature he can on any of these areas, from magic and witchcraft to, molecular science.
Yeah.
And his theory is this especially if you're writing about science, if there are 10 aspects to something and nine of the things you're writing about are based in reality, you can do anything with the 10th one, right? Because there's enough grounding to be able to play with that 10th one, right? This is a guy who writes about zombies and werewolves and stuff. So, there's a little bit, but it's true. A lot of what he writes about is science, what he incorporates is science that's actually being used and et cetera. Now, I wanted to ask you about your research process for this very reason. I'm so glad you brought
Yeah.
it up
Sure.
because he is just a devout believer in research, and of course, as a reporter, I am too, right? God. So tell me more about your research process. Tell me a little bit about, how do you become where you feel confident and versed enough in virology or rabies or any of these things to say, I can write a whole story based on this, and people won't laugh and go, she doesn't know her ass from a hole in the ground.
Well, if you think about it, and this is true with the kind of legal research I used to do as well, you're reading someone else's work and you're extrapolating out from it. You are putting together a variety of pieces to make a puzzle that is true, right? And so I usually start with books. I go and I pull down everything that'll give me the foundation of whatever it is that I want to write about, whether it's rabies or the book that I am working on right now is quantum computing, dark web. I've got a dirty bomb going off. So there's a lot of sciencey things I need to get right. So I start by buying all those books and then I just deep dive into that. I'm tabbing all these pages and things, whatever it is. And then I often talk to my dad because he is a genius. He's a science and tech guy. He knows, God knows how much he knows. But I'll go and I'll spitball ideas with him and I'll talk to him about things. And I start to pull together an idea of plot, which I completely agree with you. 90% real science, 10% something crazy is happening, right? I also do that too, about basically in that same ratio. Then once I've got a draft and I think I've got the science just where it ought to be, right? Then I find somebody who is actually in that field and I talk to them, maybe more than one somebody. When I wrote Unnatural Intent, I set it in the Arctic and I have my scientist character out on the pack ice doing all these things. But of course, I've never been on the pack ice and I don't have a way to get there. So it's not like I can go to this setting and actually experience it. I connected with a group of scientists at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and I talked to them about, okay, well, how do you actually do this? How do you land a helicopter on the pack ice? How do you take these samples? How do you do a necropsy of a polar bear, which is an autopsy?
Mhm.
How does this happen, right? So I had them tell me, and then I got them to read the book after I had done it and tell me if I got it wrong. So to catch me in anything that I had misunderstood, misinterpreted. I actually had a call yesterday with a physicist who is reading my current manuscript for me to make sure that all the quantum computing concepts and execution that I did in the story is accurate. So I think it's a multi-step process, getting it as close as you can get it to accurate, and then having someone who actually has worked in the field look at it and tell you, you're almost there, change this word, you know?
Well, we're seeing more and more emphasis on that also even in regard to cultural issues. If you have we embrace more than ever multicultural characters and that kind of thing. And there was a big deal for a long time about, people who are not of color writing characters who are
Mhm.
people are writing women, that kind of a
Yeah,
thing, and getting it wrong, and which is usually what caused the problem. And so I
yeah,
think it has inspired a lot of writers to take that same approach, not just about writing science or technical things that they don't understand, but also to have their beta readers reading also for cultural correct, not politically correct, but just getting the cultural stuff right, not having characters say or do things that they just would not normally do, right? It just seems like such a basic thing, but it's a good thing I think for all of us to remember when we write, that if you're gonna you can write outside your personal background, but get it right. Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
I want to ask you about first drafts because I think some of those things that, again, new writers in particular really struggle with. First of all, you got to get it done. You can't edit what you have not written, so you have to finish it. That's number one. But every writer I talk to has a different feeling about finishing that first draft. So one of my good friends has got about 25 books in print. He's like, yeah, when I'm done with that first draft, it's pretty much done. I've done the vast majority of the work within that process. Okay.
Mhm.
But most of the other writers I know is like, this is where I write out the garbage. And then the real writing starts in the editing process. So that's
Yeah.
one extreme to the other.
Yeah.
How do you feel about your first drafts? Is there where do you fall on that spectrum of the first draft conundrum?
Close to your friend. I'm a hardcore, you're not going to be surprised by this. I'm a hardcore plotter. I plan my books out very deeply before I start writing. I have every chapter mapped out. I mean that the outline of course does evolve because characters have their own ideas sometimes. Um, but I do tend to produce a fairly finished first draft. And part of that is because of my process, because I do work with critique groups. I have three critique groups. I've been working with them, one for probably 6 years, one for four. I mean, I've been with them for a long time. And I turn in 1,500 words a week to two of those groups. So they keep me on track each week. And because I'm turning it in, I'm not producing, as it flows out, just on the page, there it is, first draft. It's got to be refined enough that I'm not embarrassed to turn it in.
Right.
So I am editing as I go. And because I'm doing that with a plan in mind, by the time I have a completed draft, it really is pretty refined. Of course, you do have to go back in and gloss it because by the time you get to the end of the book, one of your characters has a characteristic they didn't have in the beginning, or you've added some subplot that you have to go and weave back in the little bits for it.
Yeah.
But I can usually tell at the outset of a book about how long it's going to take me to write it. Thrillers are usually around 90,000 words. If I'm turning 1,500 words a week, you can do the math. And then I know that I'm going to need a little bit of a leave it alone for a week or two period at the end to let
Yeah.
it, sit, come back to it. So anyway, it's pretty yeah, it's pretty done by the time I'm finished with a draft.
I will say I'm impressed by your dedication to plotting because plotting kills me. It's one of the hardest things I do. And my current manuscript that my agent has out there, it it took so many efforts, or multiple rewrites to get all of the various plot things that I wanted. And I discovered that for me, and again, probably I'm a journalist, so I'm very literal when it comes to these things, right? And so that 10% that we were talking about earlier, it's a little harder for me sometimes, I think, because my mind doesn't really work that way. So what I discovered for me is I take my dogs out for these long walks. We're surrounded by a lot of ag country here, so I take my dogs out for these really long walks. And it is amazing when I get away from the internet, being online, my phone, how much more clarity I get and really sticky plot points suddenly become so clear to me.
Yeah.
And that has become my process for how I solve those problems, right?
Mhm.
What is your process since plot is so important to all thriller and suspense authors, but it sounds like you particularly really put a lot of effort into your plotting.
Mhm.
How do you break plotting when you get stagnant or you run into these things? What's your process for getting out of um, that morass?
Yeah. Similar to you, I think. There's I don't remember the name of it. There's a word for the what happens in your brain when you are doing something. I'm not going to articulate it very well, but when you're running, when you're walking your dogs, oftentimes if you're in the shower, you're trying to fall asleep, your brain almost goes soft and you get the connections are easier to make when you're in that state than when you're sitting there looking at the blinking cursor going, how am I going to fix this? You know? So I oftentimes do that. I'll go for a hike, I'll go for a run, something like that. The other thing that I find really helps is to switch from the computer to a pen and paper. There's a
Hmm.
lot, something about the tactile, the flexibility of working on
Yeah.
the page. I can jot dumb ideas down, cross them out, and crossing out is better than deleting because you can still see it. So it's there. The idea's not completely gone like it would be in your laptop if you got rid of an idea, so you're still very free form figuring it out. One of those two things usually works for me when I get really stuck.
I believe every story has a heartbeat, and it's different for everybody. But what do you feel makes up the heartbeat of your storytelling? Is there kind of maybe a thematic heartbeat that you rely on, or a through line, or just kind of an
Yeah.
underpinning for your work that you if that's your comfort zone in a way?
It's funny you ask that because I do notice it with other writers as I'm reading their works. You'll have some idea that comes up again and again, redemption or false accusations or missing children, or they have this idea that they tend to come back to again and again. I don't know what mine is yet. You'll have to let me know if you see something start to emerge. As I'm writing, I'm very pace focused, because I enjoy reading things that are very fast paced. And so that is my intention as I write. is pacing largely. Each book that I have written, I have had a, kind of a theme in mind in the background as I was working on it. But with thrillers, I don't know that theme is as evident as it is in some other genres. It's not like literary fiction where so much of what you're doing is about message. In
Mhm.
thrillers, it's sort of in the background. The one that I'm working on right now, all of my characters are dealing with some form of toxic self-sacrifice. They are giving more than is healthy in different ways. And I think that comes from, being in the sandwich generation and feeling as a mother and feeling you're just constantly give, 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 give. And this idea of when the giving becomes damaging. So I
Mhm.
think that was in front of mind for me as I was working on this current book. I hope that toxic self-sacrifice does not become my thing because I'd like to say that I'm going to get past that and I'm going to not be feeling that way as I write the next one. We'll see.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've asked that question of a lot of people, and you hear lots of really interesting answers. Empathy, humanity, redemption comes up. Which
Mhm.
that's me. That's the one that I'm always drawn to. But there is always something. And thrillers are really more plot based than they are character based. Though, I mean, it doesn't mean that characters don't matter in a thriller. That's not true at all. But obviously, plot is the driving force behind most suspense and thriller stuff. But the best ones of those that I certainly read are the ones that have characters that you still care about and that
Yeah.
you don't want them to fall off that bridge or whatever the peril you've put them into. That's
Yeah.
the that's always the challenge for any of us, no matter what we're doing. I think every writer envisions their book or books becoming a movie or a TV series. And I certainly have lots of friends who've had books optioned and everything. That's an entirely different conversation, which, you know, uh, it is not anything what anyone thinks it is and probably ever will be. But let's just stay on the creative side of it here for a second. Um, you know, who would you like to see play either Letty Duquesne or Tess Oliver in a movie? Let's just say tomorrow you get that that call. We're gonna do it. We're gonna let you pick the lead character,
Uh-uh.
or the person who's gonna play your lead character. Who would play Letty Duquesne and who would play Tess Oliver?
That's funny that you asked me that because the very first time I did a book club, that was the first question that they asked me in book club is who do what actress is in this? And I think it's funny because people do tend to kind of see the books in their mind and want to know if it matches what was in my head when I wrote it. So it kind of envisioned, and this is not realistic, but I kind of envisioned Natalie Portman as Letty Duquesne. In my brain, that's sort of who she is. And then, oh goodness, who would I have for Tess? I sort of think of her as like a young Nicole Kidman, but of course, that's, I think not, it's not actually plausible, but that is sort of who I think of.
I love that. That's I you know um, my manuscript that my agent has out there. I actually did a sit down with myself and said, okay, um, think of some of these people, because this is in the early stages when I say, and this is something my agent recommended that I do to try, to maybe give myself a little more clarity as I was trying to develop this person a little more, because I had gone through a deal where there were two main protagonists, but I was winnowing it down in one of the rewrites to one and making that person really the focal point. So she said, really, this would benefit you a lot if you could visualize. And so I went through every actor and you know musician, but everyone I could think of, and it's set in sports, so every baseball player I could think, and it was actually helpful because I now have that vision that I came out with.
Hmm.
Yes, and he down. God, we've been down. I don't even know how many rewrites now, but now that it's out there in the world, we'll see. Maybe I'll ever get there too. I don't know. Well, look, I like to end on what I think is, I hope and intend to be a fun question,
Okay.
similar to the one I just asked you in a way, because I will say, let's just say I had the power, this omnipotent power, I could put you together with one of the following three people
Hmm.
for a conversation, a run, a hike, dinner, drinks, whatever it is you want. But I could put you together with this person to spend some time. Which of the three would you choose and why? There is a
Okay.
theme here. This, you're going to get it really quickly, I'm sure. But the options I'm going to give you are the great Earl Stanley Gardner, who wrote the Perry Mason books, John Grisham, needs no explanation, or
Mhm.
Charles Dickens. One of those three, who would you choose to spend a little time with and why?
Oh my goodness. I mean, long before I was a lawyer, I was an English major. So I'm gonna have to say Dickens, just because, I mean, how cool would that be? I think I've taken classes on Dickens. I'm 90% sure I have. So I would say Dickens, just to throw back to my old school English major soul. I think that would be really amazing.
Well, I'm quite sure everyone out there figured out very quickly the legal connection there. But if you didn't know, Dickens was a law clerk before he became world famous as an author. So
Yeah.
Earl Stanley Gardner was a lawyer. Obviously, John Grisham was a lawyer. So that's our legal theme here. But for those of you who may not know, Charles Dickens was actually a legal clerk before he became an author. So there was the connection. So
Yeah.
Brooke French, thank you so much for joining me today on the open mic. I encourage everybody, if you haven't already, go check out any of her books. I was reading the Carolina variant as we led up to this. I love your style. It is very fast paced and it's very engaging is the word I was looking for. So I highly recommend it to anybody out there. Check out all our work. And now you're working on something now. Do we have any idea, like, when we might see that out in the world?
Not yet. It goes to the editor February 1st.
Okay.
So we'll see. Hopefully sometime next year. We'll see.
Another thing for aspiring writers to know, this is not a fast process.
No, it is
It
not.
takes for a long time. So anyway, I'm going to repeat something I said earlier too, which is if you like the show, please, tell a friend, share it with somebody, and hopefully they will be able to learn something about writing and about what it takes to do this, and maybe things that'll help them in their own processes. That's always my goal here. Also, if you want to leave a nice review, that'd be great. Always appreciate that. And as I said earlier, if you didn't like the show, we'll just go about your way and don't tell anyone about that. But if you do go about your way, go down to the bookstore and get one of Brooke's books. I think that would probably assuage your hurt feelings. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the show. I will also say the thing I always say, I always mean it. Tomorrow is not promised to any of us. So please, whatever it is you do, make today count. So for my guest, Brooke French, and for myself, Rich Eisen, and for my two crazy English setters who were sleeping behind me, cooperating as they do every show here on the open mic, this has been the open mic writers in their own words. We will see you next time.